Even if I'm working digitally in the end, I will still begin with a pencil sketch, and we still call this type of work as kind of traditional media, and digital techniques as modern media. But we have students coming into our program now. All they've ever done is draw with a pressure-sensitive tablet on a computer. That's their traditional media. And then some of them actually kind of rankle when we say, no, put that down, paper and pencil, begin this way, because that's like, why? I can do perfectly well this other way. Certainly, I think some people still think of the computer as maybe not a crutch, but the way, I've got a sketch, it's not very good, but I'll fix it up in the computer. And that's not what the computer does. It's a tool, like the pencil or the carton dust or any of the other media. You still have to know what it is. You have to know your subject to create an accurate rendering. You have to have the skill to create that kind of illustration. It's just a particular tool. So I enjoy using the computer, and I teach computer technology, but I worry that sometimes people just rely on it a little too much. The greatest figures that I see that are done on the computer don't look like they were done on the computer. I think what it's done in a lot of ways is homogenize the way a lot of artwork looks. As soon as Photoshop was a useful tool for creating images, it had layers and multiple undos and things, everyone was using Photoshop. So if you look through books, there's a company that works with our professional organization. They publish a book every year, which is meant as an advertising vehicle. So you buy a page in it and they distribute it to art directors. So you can kind of see the evolution of techniques and technology by looking through these years worth of these creative source books. And you can tell, everyone's using Photoshop now. They all have that sort of the same plasticky, shiny, brightly colored palette appearance. They all have a very similar kind of style to them. But the illustrations that stand out have either more of a basis in traditional drawing, or they've kind of left the kind of the average use of that tool and have perfected their own technique that has something of their own talent in it. They almost look like you can't tell if they were done on the computer or by hand. And I think that's a great goal to have. As we encourage our students to develop their own techniques, we teach them all the same tools. But as they go through the program, with more advanced projects, we're also trying to get them to create their own kind of style and work in a way that is suitable to them. And I think the most successful ones will kind of transcend whatever the media is, and have a particular look that you're not thinking about how they drew it. You're thinking about what the image is, and that's, I think, important. Nowadays, we would just scan them into Photoshop at high resolution and add color digitally, and that's in fact how the most current edition of the book has been colorized. However, back at that time, the only computers that were powerful enough to do that kind of work were with NASA. So we didn't have the computing power to do that kind of work. There were problems with the reproduction, of course, because what we were doing, we're taking an image, reproducing it as a photographic print, colorizing it. That was being reproduced another time to make the plates, and then it's reproduced once more to put ink on the page. So anytime you have an image that's reproduced, goes through so many stages of reproduction, it loses a little bit of something every step along the way. That's why colorizing them in Photoshop is a much more direct approach, and there'll be very little difference from what the artist would have seen on the screen and from what would appear in the book, because it's a direct translation from digital to plate. We all learn about the printing process in our instruction, but it's one of those things until you see it and experience it, it's like, that's what that means, that's how it works. So I guess in the back of my mind, I thought, when we're on the press, we can make some adjustments there. They'll stop the press, they'll fix some things, and they'll keep going. But of course, by the time it's on the press, there's actually very little change that can be made. Part of the reason is that they don't print one sheet at a time. Books are printed in what are called signatures. If you look at any book, you'll see there are groups of pieces of paper that are together. And that's because all those were printed on one giant sheet. It was folded a number of times, trimmed, and then sewn in. So every signature would have a dozen or more pieces of art on each side of the piece of paper. So you can't on the press say, can that one be more red? Because they'd say no, because then all of them are going to be red. You can't make that kind of change. That's not what the pre-press approval is about. It's just to make sure that somebody didn't flip the brain by mistake when they put it on the press, and that did happen. Back in the day, the artists would hand label a lot of the figures. And they also drew onto the figures the leader lines that connect the label to the art. We wouldn't do that today for a number of reasons. One is that when you reproduce an image, whether it's black and white or color, if it's a halftone, the image has to be broken down into little dots, the printing dots that you see. If you look at anything that's printed closely enough, you'll see the dots that are there, and that's the printing process. However, you don't want lines to be broken up into dots, or your text. So technically what they should have been doing, and what we would do now, is we would prepare the artwork, but then on a separate piece of acetate or film, or in computer software, a separate layer in a computer program, add just things that are just black, like labels, leader lines, and so on. So when they're reproduced, these aren't turned into dots the way the artwork is. So unfortunately, all these were on those original photographs, and it was impossible to take them out by the technology available at the time we thought about it. So in the end, we ended up leaving them on the illustrations. So after the photo retoucher would hand color them, oh, that's another one of mine. After they were recolored, another graphic artist would take sort of rub-off lettering. Some of you might remember rub-off lettering with letter set kind of stuff. Where they had specially made leader lines that had black and white. The black line with a little white shadow on the top. So an artist would be putting these sheets down and rubbing off these little lines on to get them back onto the artwork. But the problem comes when we separate that. So when we take a color illustration, now it has those lines on it. To print it, commercial printing uses 4 colors of ink: cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And in the best case, all those colors are registered properly on the press. However, occasionally there's maybe a little bit of a misalignment of film when they make the plates, or the plates are just a micron slightly off as they're assembled. So occasionally a little bit of misregistration comes up. It's probably easier to see in things like your grocery flyers. If you pick up your grocery flyer, and you'll find there's a little yellow shadow to things. Again, you're going to buy lettuce. Okay, great, you throw it out. If there's a little problem on the press, they're not so worried about it. But a book, you don't want any misregistration. But there are a few figures where there's even just a slight hint of misregistration. And when that happens, those black leader lines, which are composed of all 4 colors, you'll see like a red shadow around them, or a blue shadow. So that's a problem. And that would not have happened if the leaders were separate and just on the black plate, but because they were part of the 4-color process, that made things a little bit messy. So in the newest version, which has been recolorized, all those have been removed from the art because it's almost childlike, a child's process in Photoshop to make those kinds of adjustments. And again, with a computer these days, it's very easy to remove, but the computers capable of doing that back then were hundreds and hundreds of dollars an hour to do any of that kind of work. So we ended up leaving them, even though the publisher felt they made the artwork look old-fashioned. The only cases where we did spend that amount of money to change the hand-printed labels were actually figures like this. I think this is one of the figures where initially, so there's the right pulmonary artery here, and there was a label over this that said lymph gland. But technically that's incorrect now. We don't refer to the lymph nodes as glands, they're just nodes, lymph nodes. So they did use digital retouching to remove any inaccurate or archaic language from structures. But there were only a very few cases where that had to be done back in 1990.
And that was in computer time?
Yes, this was done with a very expensive kind of high-end TV production kind of computer graphics system. We didn't do it.
Yes.
We were using Mac 2s with 4 megabytes of RAM and a 20 megabyte hard drive. We were using Macintosh computers to lay out the book. The book was designed on Macintosh computers. The artwork was scanned in as sort of for placement-only low-resolution black and white images, and then the publisher would strip in the high-resolution images at that stage. But the computers available at that time, although they were okay for laying out a book, and dealing with low-resolution images just didn't have the power or even the tools, I think, to manipulate the images in that way or add color. Photoshop didn't have layers back then. For those of you who know Photoshop, how can you imagine working without layers? You only had one undo. So if you goofed up, that was it. The service department closed in the mid-1990s with some restructuring in the Faculty of Medicine. So I went back to doing freelance work. It was at that time I also made the move, as a lot of illustrators did, to using the computer. So I still do a little bit of traditional media, not very often. Most of the work that I do these days involves using Adobe Illustrator and Adobe Photoshop for still imagery. And I worked on a number of high school and college level science and biology books for publishers here in Toronto as well as in the States. I also began just part-time teaching in the biomedical communications program. First it was just like one lecture, and then it became a course, and then it became 1 day a week, and then 2 days a week. So most of my time now is teaching in the biomedical communications program. The techniques that I've used for the work that I've done throughout my career, because it's a professional program, we want to make sure that our graduates are skilled and knowledgeable in the techniques that are still being used. Recently I've done some illustrations for the Faculty of Medicine magazine. Not technically medical art, I'm not drawing anatomy or surgery or anything, they're more editorial kinds of illustrations. But it's kind of exciting to kind of reconnect with the Faculty of Medicine Our degree comes from the Faculty of Medicine, but administratively we're part of the biology department at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. That's our main base of operations. But we've always had a long connection with medicine, with anatomy. Our students still have been taking gross anatomy with the medical students. Next year we're creating a new anatomy course for them because the way that anatomy is taught to the medical students is changing. It's more clinically oriented and it takes place over a longer time frame, which doesn't work within our program schedule and meet the needs of our students. So Ann Auger is helping us to create a brand new gross anatomy cadaver dissection course, primarily for the biomedical communication students and other graduate students in life sciences, anthropology, and so on that may want to take it to fulfill their graduate requirements. So we're still very, very close to medicine and anatomy and happy to be still a part of